The research is a project that we've carried out over the last 3 years with our local age concern. It's a participatory project that's involved a team of older volunteers from age concern as co-researchers. So that means that they've been involved in designing and developing the research and actually carrying out interviews and focus groups with other older people. They've also been involved in the coding, analysis and writing up of the research.
Part of our thinking in relation to working in that way was that we wanted to engage older people both as active subjects in the research, but also as participants, as researchers who were engaged in a dialogue to enable a much deeper understanding of what well-being actually means to older people. One of the key themes that older people identified in terms of what generates and sustains well-being is the quality of their relationships with other people. And that includes obviously intimate and close relationships within family, but it also includes friendships, encounters with strangers, so how people are treated on the streets, in shops, in banks, the sort of interactions that they have there, and of course also how they're treated by service providers, by doctors and nurses. That sort of sense of the reflection of people's own value through the way in which other people respond to them came over very powerfully.
We were quite surprised about the amount of volunteering that people were involved in doing. We had a few people who were in their 90s who had volunteered actually up until their 90s, and one or two were actually quite upset that they were no longer allowed to be volunteers. So I think related to that, it wasn't maybe so much the activity of volunteering, it was the meaning behind it. It enabled them to still feel like they could contribute something, that they still had something to offer others. And that was a very strong theme, feeling that you could still give, that you weren't just an older person who was, a burden on society, for instance, that you could have a role and purpose and actually give something back.
We did some work using the English Longitudinal Study of Aging, or ELSA, which is a large national longitudinal panel study of English men and women who are aged 50 and over in 2002. So we were interested in ELSA in looking at the relationship between people's participation in what we call socially productive activities post-retirement age and their well-being. And by socially productive activities, we're talking about activities that people consider to have some economic or social value, like paid work, but also voluntary work and caring activities. And what we found was that in terms of people's well-being, the rewards that they reported receiving from doing those activities were quite important in terms of their levels of well-being. So people who didn't feel adequately appreciated for the work that they did in terms of caring and volunteering and also paid work had lower levels of well-being than people who reported receiving adequate appreciation for those activities.
I think it's really important and that's really what I got from the presentation, it's really important to keep in mind and to really stress that not activity is not per se good for people's health, for the quality of life, and a lot of other very important social outcomes. And I think this is a really strong sends a really strong message to policymakers to really have a look what kind of volunteering, what kind of care work, and what kind of other activities people are engaged in. So it's really the question or the trap that people may be trapped into sort of non-rewarding activities or non-appreciated activities because of other things which have happened before to them in their life course.
I'm a PhD student at Leicester University. I'm looking at the work-life balance issues of older workers as they approach and transition through retirement, and seeing whether or not the policies that the organisation has put into place actually help. I looked at West Midlands Fire Service because they've got a quite interesting combination of uniformed staff and non-uniformed staff. They have different retirements, they have different contracts of employment, different working hours. So I was able to compare quite nicely the two different groups. Traditionally, the uniformed staff have retired in their 50s after they've done 30 years of work. But pension changes have meant that, and the abolition of the default retirement age, have meant that they have now got a number of people who are uniformed and still working possibly into their 60s now. But the non-uniformed staff, of course, are carrying on until they're 60, 65, 67, whatever it's going to be. I've now started to work with them on a programme to work with their older workers. Sometimes older workers just get a bit demotivated and feel a bit trapped. And obviously, as a result, they get less productive. So it's a useful business idea to be able to say, get more energized, get more motivated. And I work also with younger managers in helping them to understand what motivates, the over 50s.
Well, what I'm particularly interested in is organising age. So what organisational processes affect how we perceive ageing in the workplace. So what jobs we may think are valuable in relation to what older workers do as opposed to younger workers. And of course these categories are socially constructed, so they're constructed around how we think about ageing in society in general. So for example, what I found in recent research that I've conducted in a hedge fund is that younger workers are associated with wanting to eager to learn, so they're very eager to learn in organisations, whereas older workers have a lot of experience. But interestingly, in the financial setting that the research was conducted in, experience wasn't seen as very valuable, whereas ability to be highly productive and learn lots was seen as extremely valuable. So what was happening was that there were certain value attachments that were correlated to younger workers being seen as more valuable as opposed to older workers.
Well, what I'm talking about is a project which we did over 3 years, which was really laying the foundation for more research, I think, into the impact that training does or doesn't make on people's employment in later life. Certainly participation in training goes down with age, but the reason for that is very far from clear. On the whole, older workers say they aren't reluctant, but they aren't offered training. Employers say they offer training, but people don't take it up. And one of the things that's very clear is that a lot more training goes on in the public sector and in large organisations. And if you're an older person in those sectors, then you're likely to be training anyway. I think there are two problems. One is that people don't plan ahead. And there's a really critical question about giving people decent advice about the future somewhere around the age of 50. If you get out of the labour market after 50, your chance of getting back are very slim, and training at that point isn't very effective at getting you back into work. What you need to do is to say at the age of 50, what am I going to do with the next 25 years of my life? How much of that is going to be paid work? Is it going to be the work I'm doing now or something different? And how am I going to arrange that? Then, when people are motivated, I think training does work.
I mean, retirement evolved over the 20th century, and I think it fitted at the time where employers wanted to go in terms of parking older employees and putting them into a socially defined space where they could live out their lives in a particular way. And although there were problems with that, arguably you could say, well, that's not a bad thing in terms of an ending to people's lives. Now we've got the notion of extending working life, and that's fine, but it presupposes firstly that there's plenty of work available, good work, appropriate work, that people's health is able to do that, and also that there are work-related lifestyles which can substitute for retirements, and I'm doubtful about that.
as you're probably aware, active ageing has become a kind of very important policy directive in recent years. So the idea is that being in employment, for example, participating in voluntary organisations, being physically active, a broad range of activities are considered to be predictive of quality of life and to increase health, for example, and so it's associated with policies that will hopefully help us to solve some of the issues associated with an ageing population. But the downside of that way of thinking is that we tend to neglect actually the details of what activity means on the ground, as it were, in day-to-day practices. And it seems it's not enough just to take the kind of objective view that we need to get people, let's say, moving, just literally physical activity, or get people in jobs, no matter what those jobs are, or get people participating, no matter what the circumstances. And what we've found in our work is that really what seems to matter to people around activity are a range of factors that seem to cluster around notions of agency, for example, the issue of how much choice people have with respect to the activities they're engaging in, the way it impacts upon their powers, for example. So we tend to think of the concept of power in terms of how people are able to affect the things around them and how they're able to be affected by the things around them. And this is a rather kind of subjective orientation towards issues of activity.
I mean, the notion of active ageing, I think, is positive insofar as it emphasises the way in which you shouldn't think about old age as a time of disengagement from any activity. But I think the limitations of it are a tendency to focus on activity per se, rather than understanding the meanings activity may have for older people and the way in which, for activity itself to be valuable, it has to generate other sorts of experiences. For example, it is a way of enabling high-quality relationships. So that's one thing that I think is important. But the other thing is to really recognise that for many older people, the experience of growing older is an experience of having to learn what things they can no longer do and what new things that they might do. And for people in old age, activity genuinely does become restricted. And that doesn't mean that we should no longer think about their well-being. So we need to be able to think about well-being in the absence of activity, as well as how activity can generate well-being.